So let's do a quick recap of Chapter 5. And in Chapter 5, Clovis goes off to war. Well, actually, he's only going to get a physical. But if he passes his physical, he will be sent to war. And Gertie has convinced herself he's too old, and he's not going to pass, and they're going to send him right back. She's kind of secretly hoping that they'll use him to do something, because while he's away, she wants to buy the Tipton farm. She knows that if he's there, he'll want to take her money and use it for something different. So she's wanting to buy that farm while he's away, but then again, she's torn. She doesn't want him going to war, but she hopes they can find a use for him. Clovis was upset when he left because Gertie wouldn't wake the children and let them know that he was leaving. He wanted to tell them goodbye. But she was convinced he would only be gone a couple days and he would be back. There was no need in upsetting the children. But this very first day that Clovis is gone, the children are very upset. And they're very upset with their mom that she didn't wake them up. So Gertie spends the day trying to keep them all busy. And she works on their lessons. And once again, we see that Cassie is having trouble reading. Now, she's 5, almost 6, and still can't read. So Gertie has made a decision that from now on, when she teaches her, she'll teach her away from the other children. The chapter ends with Clyde mentioning to the other kids, they're not going to want Dad. Don't be so upset. He'll be back. He's old, and if he doesn't come back right away, I bet he got a job in a factory. And that just about blew Gertie's mind. He better not be working in a factory. He better get his butt home. She's afraid that if he goes to work in a factory, he's going to want the rest of the family to follow, and she doesn't want to go. So let's start Chapter 6 and see what it has to offer. She reached the turning in of the lane and saw with relief that she wouldn't have to ask Mrs. Hull to quit her work and come to the store. The store door was open, and sleeping in the sun by the store porch was a high-shouldered swayback mule hitched to a homemade sled. The old mule never lifted his head nor left off his dozing when she walked up, but she nodded to him as if to a neighbor, and to the thin spotted hound with the torn left ear curled asleep in the sled she spoke, her voice apologetic and touched with sorrow. I heard you 2 nights ago, Sugar Belle, but I couldn't have come. Nobody's left to come now to them foxes you hold. The old hound lifted his head and looked at her with roomy, sleepy, dull eyes. She smiled at him and then hurried up the porch steps. The small windowed store and post office seemed dark as a cave after the bright sunlight, and for an instant she could see nothing, only hear the twittering voice of her mother-in-law. Thank goodness it's Gertie. Then Mrs. Hull's pleased welcome. You've come right when you were needed the most. The blackness cleared, and Gertie saw the 2 women side by side on a homemade bench by the stove, smiling up at her, but weary, troubled under their smiles. Smiling up at her, Aunt Kate seemed smaller and thinner with whiter hair and browner skin than Gertie could remember. When she reached to pull a cockerburl off Gertie's coattail, the hand seemed some little brittle thing whittled from brown wood. But there was life and kindness in her voice as she asked, Are y'all well, Gertie? How's Cassie Marie? She didn't come with the others on Sunday about a week ago. Amos was looking good. I was plumb ashamed I never get out to see him, but I can't allus be a begging off one of Miss Hull's girls to stay with the old man. Law, Aunt Kate, Amos was mighty nigh well when I brung him home. It was mighty good of you to come and stay with the young'uns while I had him at the doctor's, Gertie said, remembering all the times she had thanked Aunt Kate for help in her time of trouble. At all the bornings of her children, it had been Aunt Kate who came instead of her mother. The children had all whooping cough when Amos was a baby hardly 6 months old. Her mother had been too puny to come, but Aunt Kate had helped her through the nights with the choking little ones and the vomiting older children. But then as now, there had been only stumbling words of gratitude, never the right words. She smiled on the older woman and wished for words, something easy and careless for asking about Clovis. She didn't want to add to Aunt Kate's worries. Troubled enough she was now with 3 other boys gone, and the baby one, Jessie, missing for 6 months. She was still hunting words when Aunt Kate, restless tongue like her sister Sue Annie, asked, "Your mother holding up pretty good?" Gertie nodded. The childhood hope that her mother could live like other people, instead of just holding up, had long since died to a wish. "I heard Clovis didn't come back from his army examination," Aunt Kate said, getting up. "That Sunday I kind of thought he acted like it was goodbye, the way he sat around with the old man. You got any notion if he's went straight to the army or to one of them factories?" Gertie shook her head. "I surely hear in the evening's mail. It'll be better in a week from now." She tried to hold her voice level and let it show nothing of the terror that had ridden her most of the time since the last mail day, when she had decided that something bad must have happened to Clovis. Almost as hard to bear as the fear were the shame and vexation that came on her now with the calmly waiting women when her mind decided that nothing was wrong with Clovis except that he hadn't bothered to write. "A week ain't hardly long enough to hear," Aunt Kate was saying. "It'll be 5 weeks and 2 days since I heard from Barney. And then it was one of them funny little letters a body can't hardly read, like the last one I got from Jessie." "You'll be hearing real soon, Mrs. Hull said, getting up, smiling at the older woman, who now, like a restless bird, had flitted to the door. "And anyhow, we got one piece of luck. Gertie can help us load this sled." Gertie set the basket of eggs on the counter, and she turned around for the first time and noticed halfway between the stove and the back of the room a sack of cow feed. The gay pattern of purple flowers and red-billed parrots of its covering seemed a thing from some gayer world, dropped off by accident into the old store, with its homemade shelves and counters and smoky brown plank walls. There was something contrary about its plump brightness stretched on the floor between the 2 weak-backed women, neither of whom had ever been any good at lifting, and Mrs. Hull with a baby hardly 6 weeks old. "I've got to learn to manage the store without a man," Mrs. Hull said. "I keep a-thinking a man will come along when I know there's no man to come." And she watched with something like envy at Gertie as she picked up the 100-pound sack of feed and tossed it lightly over her shoulder. Gertie smiled. "I reckon I'll have to be the man in this settlement. Aunt Kate, you ought to have sent for me and Reuben to get up this feed." "Oh, no, I can manage," Aunt Kate said, gathering up the reins. "We've still got plenty of coal, Clovis hauled us, and every time Reuben come, he cuts more stove wood. I've been so addled I never noticed I was running out of cow feed. And seeing as it was a pretty day, I thought a little walk would do Jerry good. He stood around so long he's a-getting stiff." She turned to the hound who had climbed out of the sled when Gertie threw in the sack of feed. "You can get back in now, Sugar Belle. All at once seems like he's gotten old and he won't hardly eat nothing. Any kind of little hunt runs him down for 3 or 4 days till he can't do nothing but sleep. I biled us all up the other day, and he didn't eat no more than an old man. Just'll be thinking I didn't take good care of him like I said I would. If'n you get any lard, Mary, recollect to save me some. Butter shortening in the biscuit bread is a-killing the old man. Gertie, I hate to run off like this, but if the house was to burn down and the old man couldn't cope with himself." She saw Cassie and Jip at her heels skipping down the lane and waving a bunch of red dogwood berries. "Let her go with me, Gertie. She'll be a sight of good company." Gertie hesitated because she seldom let Cassie go visiting alone, forever spilling things and falling down, wandering off into the woods, talking to herself and confusing her deaf old grandfather. She might be more trouble than company. But while she hesitated, Aunt Kate had stopped the sled, Cassie jumped in, and now was commanding Jip to come ride with Sugar Belle. There was nothing for Gertie to do but remind Cassie to be a good girl and help her grandma, and call to Aunt Kate not to make another trip for the mail. She would bring it and get Cassie. "Recollect," Mrs. Hall called, "it'll be late. Uncle Ansel is a-riding his mule." The mule had started again, and Kate followed, giving no sign that she heard. "I wish she sat on that sled and ride," Gertie said. "She can't hardly sit still a minute," Mrs. Hull said. "She keeps a thinking she'll hear from Jessie. She won't give in to believing that missing in action so long could mean—" Remembering Gertie's uncounted eggs, she turned back toward the door of the stove. Gertie followed and then stopped in the doorway. "My trading can wait till the mail come. I'll come." One finger popped up and then another before she could bring out the words. "To tell you the truth, I just got so fidgety wondering on Clovis, I just started out. I thought maybe you and Aunt Kate, somebody knowed." "It's the first few days that's worse," Mrs. Hull said. "About all a body can do is keep real busy." "That's one of my troubles right now," Gertie said. "I'm pretty well caught up on the fall work, and renting a place ain't like having 1 year to do your own work on." She looked at a small patch of ground that bordered the lane, a dead-looking spot that seemed mostly weeds. "Miss Hull, couldn't I dig your taters? I'd rather be a-doing something and a-visiting than waiting." Mrs. Hull looked at the little field, starting to say something, but then choked. Gertie remembered that Andy, her oldest child, had planted the potatoes, taking time out from high school in March. In May he graduated, and now in early November he was on the other side of the world. "Where's a spade and fork?" she asked, more and more ashamed of her own weak ways. When her turn at waiting came, and when Mrs. Hull hesitated, she insisted. "Back in the old days, everybody helped the preachers do their work, and it'd be a sin to let 'em rot." "But you must let me pay you," Mrs. Hull said. "Samuel's not a preacher now. He's left God's work for Oak Ridge," she shivered, "whatever that is." "Why, I reckon he thinks it's his patriotic duty," Gertie said, as she went with Mrs. Hull for the spading fork. She didn't like the accusing way the woman spoke of Samuel, for he, among all the preachers she had ever known, seemed the closest to God. He worked with his hands like Jesus, but better yet, she'd never heard him try to scare the souls of the people loose and herd them up to God like driving stampeded sheep into a locked barn. She thought sometimes on Samuel and the other ones away as she worked, sending the prongs of the spading fork slowly down with her foot and then gently pushing back with one hand on the handle so the hill of the potatoes came up with the earth, unscarred and whole. The shadows of the little mounds of earth she made shortened, turned more northward, but lay a little westward, and when Mrs. Hull called her to come to the good and bountiful dinner she and Rachel, the oldest girl, had cooked. She and Mrs. Hull and the 7 little Hulls of eating size sat about the long oilcloth-covered table in the kitchen, while the baby slept in the back bedroom and the radio played softly in the front room. They ate with little talk. Mrs. Hull was absent-minded, passing Gertie the fried fresh ham twice, and never the potatoes at all. Once she went to see about the baby, she said, but she must have looked at the clock in the front room, for when she sat down again, she said, "I always hoped that they'd never take Clovis. You could have kept a man here running the mail. When Uncle Ansel rides his mule, seems like mail day waiting lasts forever." "Where's Andy?" Gertie asked, and hoped her voice would sound the way that she had hoped it would sound, easy and off-like, as if he were just visiting, not low and sad in the way her mother had always wanted people to ask about her health. "His letters come through New York and from that way, and it sounds like he's in France," Mrs. Hull answered. She had learned to manage her voice. France, to the listening children, might have been a neighbor's place over the hill. Gertie shook her head to Mrs. Hull's after dinner, urging that she sit for a while and listen to the news broadcast that came at 12 o'clock. Mrs. Hull's house, like her mother and most houses, smothered her. It was good to be alone back on the potato patch, but the sun had hardly started down the sky before she heard a woman's voice and children's clatter in the lane. She looked up to see Mamie Childers with the baby on one arm and a split basket of eggs in her other hand, the basket dragged down by the child, hardly of walking size, whimpering and stumbling as it hung on to the handle. Some distance behind came her oldest, no older than Amos, but big enough to carry an empty coal oil can. Mamie saw Gertie and started to wave, but remembered she had no free hand. and came on so fast the toddler let go of the basket and stood wailing in the road. "Has the mail got in yet?" Mamie asked, gasping, putting the basket of eggs on the ground and letting her tired body sag against the fence. She didn't live much more than a mile away, but it was an uphill climb with such a dragging load. "Uncle Ansel had to ride his mule," Gertie explained. "It'll maybe be on the other side of sundown before he gets in." "Oh," Mamie said, and then again, "Oh." Gertie thought she was going to cry when she said, her voice still breathless, "I can't be a dark getting back home." She asked quickly, as if afraid of the answer, "Is the old mill so tore up that Clovis can't fix it?" "Clovis is gone," Gertie said, bending to dig another hill. "Lord, Lord," Mamie said, her words a kind of troubled moaning. "What'll I do if I run out of coal? I can't cut wood to do no good. And what'll we-uns do now if a young'un gets sick and nobody's there to take him to the doctor?" "I'll tuck mine on a mule," Gertie said. "But you've got some big young'uns, big enough to leave by themselves at home," Mamie said. She was leaning heavily on the fence, as if leaning of the goneness of Clovis. The last man had been the last burden her tired body could bear. But her eyes, Gertie thought, looked more sick than tired. They were big and bright as the eyes of a child just coming out from a long spell of fever. "Why don't you go sit with Miss Hull and listen to the radio? You look plumb tuckered. We'll all get along somehow," Gertie comforted. "Don't tell me to go listen to no radio," Mamie said. "Alec got me one before he left." "It'll be company," he said, "but I hate the thing." "They say the war news ain't so bad," Gertie said. "Oh, it ain't the news. And anyhow, Alec ain't in Germany where Hitler is. He's in France. Miss Hull flagged his letters." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It's the people on the radio. I can't get used to 'em. I forget." She looked at Gertie, held her with her eyes. "T'other night I was coming in from milking. It was a mist and rain and already dark in the valley, and I heard this woman a-talking in the house. And she didn't talk so queer sounding like most of 'em do on the radio does. And I thinks to myself, somebody's come a-visiting and they'll maybe stay all night. And I broke into a run and I spilled half the milk and was clean through the kitchen before I recollected the radio. And I knowed I was still by myself. The young'uns thought I was crazy when I cried, but it would have been good on that black rainy night to have had some neighbor woman for company." "Law, woman," Gertie said, moving to the next hill. "You got plenty of company, your young'uns. They're a sight of company in just a little baby. And your stock of good milk cow is a kind of friendly thing. And all snug down there in the valley with trees close and the creek to hear and then the radio." Mamie shook her head with despair at Gertie's lack of understanding. "But what if I mistook again when I heard people, real people, and I just thought it was the radio, and it was somebody mean maybe coming to kill me and the young'uns?" "But honey, there ain't nobody left in the whole country to hurt a body," Gertie said, looking away from the woman's eyes and then back again, smiling. "But if it'll make you feel any better, I'll send Clyde down tomorrow evening to stay the night. And when the weather turns bad, she can stay with your little young'uns long enough for you to maybe come and get your mail." Mamie had flashed her a look of unexpressible gratitude when a wail from down the lane caused her to turn her head and then cry, "Oh, Lordy, Lordy, I can't as much as talk for these young'uns." She rushed to the 2-year-old who had fallen into a muddy rut in the road and now laid screaming, gummed from head to foot with mud and water. Gertie hurried with her digging. If she wasted much more time gabbing, she wouldn't finish the patch by dark. But as always, she paused a moment at the end of the row away from the house. Samuel's ridge fields were even higher than her rented ones. Standing on the edge of the field, she could see across the valley of the Big South Fork, where white painted houses like Samuel's and her mother's shone on the green lawns above brownish fields of shocked corn that stretched down to the willow-fringed river. Higher than the houses rose the hay and pasture fields, still green from the rainy fall. The fields went up the lower slopes of the front row of hills to meet the timber near the top. And past this first row of timbered peaks and ridges, others stretched away for miles and miles. She always hurried at the other end near the store, where there was nothing to see but the little hulls beginning to do their night work. She heard through the open front door the hum of Mrs. Hall's sewing machine and one of the younger boys singing to his baby brother, whom Andy, the oldest, had never seen. But louder than anything was Mamie's talk, a loud, excited, half-laughing, half-quarreling talk, the noise of a woman with her tongue hungry for talk. More people came down the lane, children running, women with babies in their arms walking tiredly, old women like Sue Annie hurrying with no wind left for gossip. They would see her and forget the old greetings of other days like, "How's your mother holding up, Gertie?" Or, "Lo, it's been a time since I have seen you. When you a coming to stay all day?" Instead, they all, young and old, asked with breathless abruptness, "Has the mail gotten in?" And she would shake her head and explain that Ansel's car was broken down and he rode his mule, and most likely he wouldn't be in until past sundown. They were usually stricken silent and would stand for a moment in the lane, uncertain of what to do, but always more slowly and often wearily they would go on to Mrs. Hall's house or to the post office porch. Some, hungry for talk like Mamie, continued to stand by the fence, but Gertie had worked her way almost across the little field, and the distance made conversations brief. Even Sue Annie could talk only a little after being stopped dead in her tracks by the news of the lateness of the mail. "And here I am," she cried from across the field, "tuckered clean out from a washing. I rushed through dinner and hurrying up the hill when I ought to have been a butchering my fattened hog. And by tomorrow morning, most of that'll likely be warm again and in a raining, and Nellie Sexton a having her baby." "The wind set in from the north," Gertie called back. "But that won't hold back Nellie's baby," Sue Annie cried, turning with a suspicious sniff toward the north. She tried to call out some opinion on the weather, but between the quick walk up the hill and her calling conversations, even she was too breathless to speak out loud enough for Gertie to understand. Yet some minutes later, when Gertie had dug to the end of the row next to the post office, Sue Annie, all her wind came back, was carrying on about Clovis. What if Uncle Ansel's grist mill broke down and they had to eat boughten meal? The government owed them at least one man who would fix anything and never got drunk. Gertie turned to the next row, glancing half hopefully, half fearfully down the lane as she did. It was too early for old John, she told herself. He was no weak woman to come rushing for the mail before his day's work was done. Still, she looked again before she was hardly to the middle of the row, but saw only Ann Liz Kramer, Claude Kramer's wife, with the younger half of her family, come from across the big South Fork. The woman waved to her and Gertie waved, and then listened to Ann Liz's laughing account of the wild time they had on the High Swift River in the little skiff overload with themselves and the eggs and the molasses that they had bought to sell. The Kramers, her mother said, were getting rich out of the war. None of the boys or Claude had enough book learning to go to the fighting, but Claude and the 4 older children, one of them a girl, had factory jobs in Muncie and batched while Ann Liz and the younger ones farmed. Now there was hardly a mail, but what brought a package of some finery or house plunder for Aunt Liz? She thought on Aunt Liz and her farming as she reached the far end of the row, where far below her a narrow band of shadow like a black line on a blue lake of a river told her more than a clock of the turning down of the day. Standing there, looking out across the world, the war, with all it brought and all it took away, seemed somewhere else. Not near enough to shorten her breath and chill her hands as when she listened to Mamie or sat in Mrs. Hull's crowded house. She only had to look up from the creek, from the shadow on the river, to a place hidden in the fold of the hills, and all the twisting troubles would leave her. Sorrow there for Henley dead, and worry for Clovis gone, but even these could not take away from the wonder of the thing waiting for her as the promised land had waited for the Israelites, the Tipton place. Maybe in only a few minutes now, it would be her own. The shadows crossed the river and touched the willows and the red birch on the other side. and then strode steadily up the westward hillside. One by one, the white houses seemed to slip under a thin blue cloak of smoke that thickened on the river. Though high above, the wooded hills stood warm-looking and faintly pink in the low red sun. Black coal smoke rose from the post office chimney, and from inside there came the cries of jabbers of little young'uns and snatches of talk from the women, still sounding scattered, like the talk of women in church before services began. Even the older children were touched by the waiting. More than one would stop, the way her own acted now that Daddy was gone, and would suddenly start working or playing, head lifted and listening. Its face for an instant would be like the faces of old women, or the young ones with babies on their arms who came every moment or so to stand on the porch and look up the lane and listen. There was still sunlight enough to make shadows on the high ridges when old John came, walking slowly and stiffly. Gertie looked at him, eager yet afraid, though people said he'd brought it just as a favor to Silas Tipton, who needed the money to move his family. What if he didn't want to sell the place? She waited, calling to him with her eyes, but he never raised his head. He walked on down the lane with his eyes on the ground, but not like a man studying the ground. His shoulders and his bent, stringy neck bespoke a man so old and tired, he looked at the ground because it was the easiest thing to do. He looked so old. She sighed as she turned back to the digging. He had 4 sons and 3 sons-in-laws scattered all over the world fighting, and even his children not in the war were scattered. The spading fork handle was sweaty under her hands, and she studied him as he turned up the post office steps. He looked like he was in a selling humor. Her father always said he would never have sold his timber if he hadn't had a bad spell of rheumatism and no child left to help him. She realized that while she'd been gaping after John, her peace and silence had been destroyed. All the Hull children, helped it seem by everybody else waiting for the mail, had come into the potato patch loaded with all the Hull tubs, baskets, buckets, and old gunny sacks to gather potatoes. She saw the some sorrow that Aunt Kate and Cassie were among them. She started to scold the old woman for wearing herself out with a useless trip to the post office when she could have taken the mail and gotten Cassie, but instead Aunt Kate scolded her for having done such a great deal of digging. So this is really an anxious time. The mail only comes like once a week, and they're relying on an old man with a donkey to deliver the mail because there are no men around to fix the trucks that struggle running. All the men are gone. All that's left, all that the army has left them in their settlement are old men that are tired and weary and can't do farming. And so all the women have come to town. They've drugged their children, they've drugged their dogs, they've drugged their cows, and waiting for the mail. They don't know where their husbands are. They don't know where their sons are. Gertie's waiting to find out where Clovis is because she hasn't heard from him. And everyone is Twitter with excitement and nervous. But also, the man that Gertie wants to talk to about selling her the Tipton place has just come into town, and she's really nervous about asking him if it's for sale. So she's trying to keep very busy by digging potatoes. "Law, Aunt Kate," she said, lifting her head, smiling, flinging back her hair. She realized old John was looking at her, and that in his eyes, dimming and bluing up with age, there was something of warmth and gladness that had used to be his when he looked at the timbered hillside he had watched grow from saplings to tall timber. "Gertie, you're about the best tater digging hand I've ever seen," he said. The warmness in his eyes widened, spread until his hollow, gray-whiskered cheeks wrinkled with smiles. "Why, I bet I ain't better than Mary was at my age, and she was hardly half my size," Gertie said. He glanced around to make certain no one noticed, and took a long, reflective, rolling chew on his quid, and then spat with careful precision at a little sand rock. He stepped nearer and glanced quickly around again, and then said in a voice hoarse with his attempt at whispering, Gertie, there's a little piece of business me and you ought to go into right away. She gripped that spading fork handle and leaned on it heavy and looked hard at the potatoes she had just dug. Her insides were all a-tremble like some colt of a boy who had just begged a little girl into the bushes, but won't let on how tickled to death he is that she wants to go. She moved to the next hill and pushed the spading fork down and got herself in hand. You mean you're wanting me to move and kind of ashamed to say so? You needn't be. That place ain't a-fitting for nothing. I'll have to feed mighty close to make the little corn I've raised run me till picking time, and you know I ain't hardly got no stock at all to feed. Well, now, Gertie, you know I ain't a-trying to make you move. I allus said that you was one of the best renters I ever had. And he spat again and looked at her sideways from the corner of his eye, smiling a little. But if me and you could do a little trading, your renting days would be over. She dropped the weight of her hand onto the spading fork handle and wondered that he could not hear the jumping of her heart. Oh, Lord, Uncle John, what the old preacher says is the truth. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. Right now, don't it seem like the time to be a-talking about renting? Didn't you know they got a Clovis and I'm all tore up? John spat with a gesture of disgust. Now, Gertie, I know Clovis is gone, and you're his wedded wife, and you feel bad and you miss him. He glanced around again, and he made a still greater effort to whisper. But you ain't no Mamie Childers lost on a little farm without a man. Now, I don't mean a word of harm, and I like Clovis, and I hope they'd leave him. He's got a good turn, and when it comes to tinkering, there ain't nothing on earth he can't fix. But just between you and me, and I mean no harm, when he was at home, he weren't worth a continental to you and the crop a-making. His coal hauling wasn't regular, and his tinkering didn't bring in much. He loved it too well, and he'd tear down some fellow's old car and set it up again and maybe never get paid. Gertie smiled at him. Them army wages comes in mighty steady. I won't be having to pay for rain on some poor piece of corn on a sandy ridge top, fit for nothing but scrub pine. Why, I'm a-thinking about renting Lister Tucker's house right now by the road, and never a-bothering with no crops. It'll just be handy to the school and the mail. She's playing hard to get, isn't she? Old John smiled. He knew she was lying. Now, Gertie, you know you couldn't do without making a crop of some kind. That's me. That's me, because I know I'm going to have to go away for quite a while and probably leave this summer for my health. And I still am going to put my garden in, and I'm just going to watch it as long as I can and take care of it as long as I can. And then it belongs to whoever needs it. I just couldn't go a season without planting something. Old John smiled because he knew she was lying. Now, Gertie, you know you couldn't do without making a crop of some kind. And as for being handy to the school, why, everybody knows the schoolhouse and will sit there cold and empty till the war is over. He smiled again and he patted her shoulder. I reckon you was a-thinking of a renting Lister's place while you was a-going over to the old Tipton place. I seen your whittling sign where you'd set up by the spring and tried to figure out how you'd get it from me for half the price. And knowing I never wanted it in the first place. Gertie, completely beside herself now, tossed back her head and smiled, and then bent to another potato hill, speaking careless-like to the spading fork handle. Oh, law, Uncle John, I hadn't hardly thought about a thing about it. A woman's got no business trading around without her man. But how much will you give me to take it off your hands? He smiled at her as she started up the next hill. Many's the time, Gertie, I wished you could have been one of my own. You're mighty nigh as good a hand at farming as I am, and if I don't watch out, you'll get the better of me in this trade. He looked at her a moment in the silence, his head twisting upward a little, for she was taller than he. Do you know why I'm a-doing this, Gertie? Offering you land for the same price I paid for it? Something I ain't never done? 'Cause 50 years ago, I bought cut-over timberland for 50 cents an acre, but I sold it for more. Some of it I've still got growed up in timber. He remembered the sold timber, the cut trees, and he was for an instant an old man, unable to steady his wandering mind. He looked away towards the hills and then back to Gertie. It's for your old pop. I seen him the other day. He hesitated, looking at her, and Gertie, no longer able to act uninterested, nodded as he went on. I ain't a-trying to meddle in your business, but your pop told me about the money they gave you. Even he thought to buy the place, he said. He'd give his good leg to know you could always be close by to him, close enough that he could come set in your house sometimes. He cleared his throat and he spoke carefully, as if his words were unsteady feet on slippery ice. Your pop ain't had an easy life. It's like Sue Annie says, Henley was his boy too, and his onlyest boy. So that place is yours, Gertie, for what I paid, $500. Whatever you give to me to take down, and the rest on time with interest, half a less than the bank, 5.5. Gertie nodded, but it was a moment before she could speak, and then her voice came choking and halting. I can pay it all, Uncle John. All these years. She thought she was going to cry. She stood a long time bent over a potato hill, unable to see the spading fork, the undug potatoes forgotten. It couldn't be true. So many times she thought of that other woman, and now she was that woman. She considereth a field, and buyeth. With the fruit of her own hands she planted a vineyard. A whole vineyard she didn't need, only 6 vines maybe. So much to plant her own vines, set her own trees, and know that come 30 years from now she'd gather fruit from the trees and grapes from the vines. She hardly heard old John as he talked on about the price of land. He didn't think land would ever get any cheaper. She was paying about $8 an acre with that good log house thrown in. Some would say that was high, and other ones remembering 50 cents an acre for cut over land. But now there were more people, but no more land. She realized he'd grown silent, and he looked up. She saw that he stood with one hand behind his ear, listening toward the road. She looked about and saw that the women and children who a moment ago had been talking were all still. Even Sue Annie was like a frozen woman. Gertie thought for an instant of a game the children played where on signal everybody had to stop and hold themselves exactly where they were. But hound dogs never played games, and now they stood still, heads lifted, listening like dogs. She heard it then, the sound faint on some high spot on the ridge road far away. A strange car was coming. Not the grocery truck, but a car. The only cars that came now brought news. It seemed like something was choking her. She stood with the spading fork gripped in both her hands. She wanted to go on with her work and dig another hill, but she couldn't. Maybe it was some coal truck the government had left by mistake out hunting a load of coal. Unless a man were lost or hurt or killed in the war, they didn't make special trips to bring the news. She tried to reason, but ice-cold hands, stronger than any human hands could be, were squeezing her chest and back and pushing on her throat. It wasn't her turn. Clovis had only been gone 10 days. Her turn had come with Henley. It wouldn't come back. Turn by turn, she told herself. Still she listened with her whole body as the others listened, heads lifted, nostrils faintly flared for the thin wind. It was nothing, not a thing. They'd all been scared by a wandering airplane. And then Matthew, Samuel's oldest boy at home and 12 years old, who stood by the fence, called to the older and those further down the field. It's a car. It's a good running car that don't hardly make any noise. It's a-coming this away. Old John's faded eyes searched the faces of those nearest to him. He understood from them what was happening, though he had heard nothing. He straightened his shoulders and spat out his quid, buttoned his jumper, and then stood, shoulders braced, hands hanging empty by his sides, and waited like an innocent man standing up to be sentenced in court. Gertie looked at him and remembered his 4 sons were fighting. From him, her glance went to Aunt Kate, who had been kneeling, emptying the potatoes the children brought in buckets and baskets into a tub. The old woman knelt with an unemptied bucket clutched in her hands, her head lifted, her eyes fixed on the road. In her ashy face, the eyes were wide and bright, straining and fighting to know. They made Gertie think of Cassie's eyes when Cassie tried to read and couldn't. Her hands would be clammy cold like Cassie's. Of which boy was she thinking? It was enough to know the news car brought was it was enough to know that the news cars brought was never good. Gertie plunged the spading fork into the ground and went and took the old woman by the arm. "Let me get you back into the store," she said, and pulled her to her feet. Aunt Kate's weight dragging on her hand seemed hardly more than that of Cassie, but her steps were uneven and springless. She was old, older than the old ought to have ever been, old like her father, and John, and Clovis's father, and all the other old ones with the young in war. Gertie led her up to the porch where Mrs. Hull stood, looking down the lane as she rocked Mamie's baby in her arms. Mrs. Hull's ears were dead to the child's crying, a weary, frightened weeping, as if some of its mother's long terror had entered into it before it was born. So all of these women now and all of these old men are petrified because they hear a car coming. And they know that when a car comes through their settlement now, it brings news of death. He put Kate on one of the benches in front of the store stove. Mamie's baby hushed its crying, and in the silence Gertie heard a car. It was round the bend by the schoolhouse, following the gravel clean to the end, plainly hunting for someone. She sat for an instant by old Kate, and though their bodies did not touch, she could feel the old woman's quivering through the bench. She got up. She wished she were back in the potato patch, digging hard and alone, able to look out towards the hills. My help cometh from the hills. Don't you love that? She wanted to begin at the beginning and say it all to Kate, but when she looked at her, she could not. The old woman's unnaturally bright and somehow pleading eyes were fixed on the stove, holding to it, as if the stove and not the bench she gripped with the hand on either side of a knee would hold her up. "Couldn't I get you a drink or something, Aunt Kate?" she asked at last. Kate shook her head with a slow quivering, but would not look away from the stove. "It ain't turned off no place, has it?" "Not yet." Old Sugar Bell, wandering in with other hounds and young children, came sniffing out Kate and laid his head in her lap. He looked up at her, and the old woman seemed to take comfort from his touch and began to smooth his forehead as if he were a troubled child. Gertie left them so, looking at each other, and went to stand on the porch with the rest of the company that was gathering there. The sound of the car came steadily now, and in a moment Gertie saw a flush of metal in the low sun as the car came through a place in the ridge road where the pines were thin. Even Sue Annie and the frightened baby continued to be silent, listening, watching, and waiting. All were like people huddled together in a wild storm, looking out, looking up, wondering what was next that the wind would take or lightning would strike. Old Lucy Anderson, with her 5 sons gone and her husband away with the mail, stood stiff and still on the top porch like a wooden woman. Old John, his hat in his hand, his thin shoulder blades like folded wings under his buttoned-up jumper, as he tried to stand straight with his head lifted up, waited on the bottom step in front of the women to take the message that the car brought. He would talk to the strangers in the strange car, not because he was John Ballou, the richest man, the largest landholder in the voting precinct of 3 school districts, but because he was the man, the only man among the company of women and children. The car came out of the pines and down the road between Samuel's fenced fields. Sue Annie whispered, "It's the same one that brought word about Hanley and Jessie." Mrs. Hull, shivering like a woman with a cold, whispered, "Shh, Kate'll hear." But a moment or so later, when the car turned down the lane, Sue Annie was whispering again. It's the same car, and I do believe it's the same woman. She wore a kind of curdly coat made out of like them little black lambs. It seemed long enough for the sun to go down before the car came on and stopped in front of them in the porch steps. A fattish woman with a high bosom, a red cross marker on one arm, and dressed in a coat of black lamb hides, as Sue Annie had said, opened the car door and got out slowly, like a woman not much to moving herself around. A youngish woman, bareheaded and barehanded, continued to sit in the driver's seat, turning ahead a little to look at the children gathered in a tight huddle by the empty gasoline pump, but never lifting her glance to old John directly in front of her or to any of the company. Gertie, watching as the others watched, trying to read the faces, the hands, the way the fattish woman walked around the car, thought the news they brought was bad, very bad. Else the young one would have opened the car door to speak, or at least looked up and smiled. All eyes were fixed on the large black pocketbook the fattish woman held in her two hands, and looking down at it, she opened it as she walked. The message was in it, Gertie realized, and Gertie's eyes were like all the others, fixed on the purse, twisting into it, searching out its secrets. The gold thing on the purse was unclasped at last, and the woman drew back the flap and looked in, but without taking anything out. She paused, her fingers fishing in the purse while everyone looked at her, and John said, "Evening, ma'am, did you bring us word?" He stopped, forgetful of his manners and what he would say, as he, like all the others, tried to find the word in the broad face where a young girl's big red-lipped mouth was painted on under the old woman's watery blue eyes. The face looked sober and concerned, but more than anything taken up with the awareness of the importance of its business. John, failing to find anything there, he pried at the purse with his eyes, and like the others, he pried and tore harder still with his glance, when after some rummaging, she brought out a yellow envelope. A little gasp went out from the crowd. A yellow envelope like that had come for Jessie back when it was dogwood blooming time, and another for Henley a little after molasses making time. No one moved forward. It was as if by not stretching forth a hand for it, the death or the pain or wounds of the lostness waiting there would pass by and go into some other hand outstretched for it. The silence was so heavy while the woman looked at the name that Gertie heard cowbells in the cow's horn across the river and far away, and behind her in the door Aunt Kate's gasping, uneven breath. Then it was as if Aunt Kate, by making sound, had asked for the letter and taken it for herself, when the woman said, looking at John, "We have a message for Lorenzo Nevels. Is he here?" All the trembling and the weakness left Aunt Kate, and her eyes shone blindly wide and sick in her face. Unseeing like eyes going through the dark, she stepped forward with her outreached hand, saying, "My man, he ain't come. Give it to me." She walked alone across the porch steps while Gertie hated herself for whatever had happened to Kate's own. Something inside her snapped up and free like a young hickory held down by a swinging boy, leaping free and rising straight. It wasn't Clovis. The message would have come to her, and all the others too. She thought there was the instant sinful secret leaping up in their hearts. Not mine, not mine. The bluish-white ring that had an instant before framed Lucy Anderson's mouth had dissolved, and the redness spread like a fire over Mrs. Hull's neck and faded. The stranger woman's painted mouth was widening and spreading as if she held out the yellow envelope, and her voice was grudgingly kind as she said, "Last time I brought you bad news, and now I'm so glad to bring you good news. Very good. Your missing son has been found. He's a prisoner of war." She handed Kate the yellow letter. Her bright voice went on and on, something about the Red Cross in town and food packages and where to send them. Gertie caught the word Italy and then forgot to listen with her worry over Kate. The woman stood with the envelope in her hand, staring straight into the face of the other, but a body could tell that none of the strange woman's words were sinking in. for Kate was like a woman made of starch caught in the rain. Her knees were bending and her shoulders were humping. At last she settled slowly down onto the porch step, still holding the envelope carefully, as if it had been some precious and fragile thing. Carefully, as if it had been something that would break. She lifted her head and listening still like a child hearing words it cannot understand. The crowd listened less, but maybe understood more than Kate at the words good news. Breaths had gone out in long, relieved gasps. Some, like Mrs. Hill and Lucy Anderson, were half crying, "Thank God, oh, thank God!" While Sue Annie quarreled in a shrill whisper, "Jesus God, what fools are wasting good gasoline to scare the living daylights out of us all!" and reached in her apron pocket for a chew to moisten her dry mouth. The woman's talk came at last to an end. There followed a silence that seemed to last a long while, and then the woman was saying, somewhat sharply, as if she had already said it once, "Are there any questions, Mrs. Neville?" There was more silence until Sue Annie whispered shrilly, "Kate, the woman's asking you, is there anything you want to know? Thank her for her trouble." Kate looked confused, as if she had never known she'd had a sister named Sue Annie, and then quickly back at the woman, as if wondering who she was and why she came. No. She said at last, and then again, no. And then added in the polite, toneless words, "I thank you kindly for your trouble."